Blackwells Longing. Raised in the shadow of the throne, Lady Juliana of Hymir knew her place. But when the king's most trusted knight, Sir Aldrich Montrose, pulled her aside before court, his voice was edged with warning. "You do not belong here," he murmured. "If you stay, you will not survive." Chapter 1. The Whispered Warning. The great hall of Hymir Castle thrummed with the low, constant murmur of courtly life. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows depicting the lineage of kings, splashed across the polished stone floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Lady Juliana of Hymir, her gown of deep azure silk whispering against the rushes strewn across the floor, moved through the throng with a practiced grace that belied the tremor of unease within her. She was a creature of this court, raised within its gilded cage, yet she had always felt like an outsider looking in, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Her hair, the color of ripe wheat, was bound in an intricate braid interwoven with pearls, a style dictated by the queen, a constant reminder of her position. Juliana was not merely a noblewoman, she was a ward of the queen, a carefully cultivated asset in the intricate dance of power and alliances. Her beauty, a delicate blend of sharp cheekbones and wide, gray eyes that held a perpetual hint of melancholy, was another weapon in the royal arsenal. Today, however, the usual anxieties that plagued her, the fear of displeasing the queen, the pressure to make a suitable match, the stifled yearning for something more were overshadowed by a deeper, more immediate dread. It had begun with a dream, a recurring nightmare of shadows and whispers, of a falcon plummeting from the sky, its wings broken and bloodied. And then, there was the unsettling change in Sir Aldrich Montrose. Sir Aldrich, the king's most trusted knight, a man whose very name evoked images of unwavering loyalty and stoic strength, had always treated her with a distant courtesy, a respectful acknowledgement of her station. He was a figure carved from granite, his face etched with the lines of countless battles, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, holding a depth of sadness that mirrored her own. He was a legend whispered in hushed tones, a warrior who had single-handedly defended the king during the border skirmishes with Northwood, a man whose honor was as unyielding as the steel of his sword. But this morning, as she had passed him in the hallway leading to the great hall, he had stopped her, his hand calloused and strong, yet surprisingly gentle, briefly resting on her arm. The contact had sent an unexpected shiver through her, a frisson of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a heightened awareness, a sense of impending danger. His voice, usually a deep, resonant rumble, had been low and urgent, a whispered warning that sent a chill down her spine. "You do not belong here," he had murmured, his gaze intense, searching. "If you stay, you will not survive." His words echoed in her mind, a discordant note in the carefully orchestrated symphony of courtly life. She tried to dismiss them, to tell herself it was merely the fatigue of the long winter, the strain of the upcoming spring tournament, the weight of the queen's expectations. But the look in his eyes, the raw, uncharacteristic urgency in his voice, had unsettled her to her core. She sought refuge in the familiar rituals of the court. She exchanged polite greetings with Lord Elmsworth, a portly nobleman whose attempts at flirtation were as clumsy as they were persistent. She offered a demure smile to Lady Beatrice, a viper in velvet, whose sharp tongue could cut deeper than any blade. She listened with feigned interest to the endless gossip about alliances and betrayals, the subtle shifts in power that dictated the lives of everyone within the castle walls. But beneath the surface of her composure, Aldrich's words continued to churn. "You do not belong here." It was a sentiment she had felt herself, a constant undercurrent of displacement, a feeling of being a stranger in her own home. She had always attributed it to her unusual upbringing, to the shadow of her mother's death, a tragedy that had occurred when Juliana was but a babe, leaving her in the care of the queen. Her mother, a woman she knew only through faded portraits and whispered stories, had been a renowned beauty, a woman of spirit and fire. She had also been a foreigner, a princess from a distant land, brought to Hymir as part of a fragile peace treaty. The court had never truly accepted her, and Juliana had always sensed that the same subtle prejudice extended to her. The king, a distant and imposing figure, had always treated her with a detached benevolence. He provided for her, ensured her education, and spoke of her future marriage with the same clinical detachment he used to discuss matters of state. He was not unkind, but he was not a father. He was a monarch, and she was a piece on his chessboard. The queen, however, was a different matter. She was a woman of formidable intellect and steely resolve, a ruler in her own right, even if she wielded her power through whispers and subtle manipulations. She had taken Juliana under her wing, shaping her, molding her, preparing her for a role that Juliana had never fully understood. The queen had taught her to dance, to sing, to play the lute. She had drilled her in the intricacies of courtly etiquette, the subtle art of flattery and deception. She had instilled in her a sense of duty, of obligation, of the importance of putting the needs of the crown above all else. But she had never offered her warmth, or affection, or the unconditional love that Juliana craved. As the afternoon wore on, the great hall began to empty. The musicians, weary from their hours of playing, packed away their instruments. The servants began to clear away the remnants of the midday meal, the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine lingering in the air. Juliana found herself alone, standing by one of the tall, arched windows, gazing out at the courtyard below. The spring sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the training grounds. She could see the knights practicing their swordsmanship, their movements fluid and graceful, yet deadly. She watched as Sir Aldrich, his dark hair gleaming in the fading light, effortlessly disarmed a younger knight, his movements precise and economical, devoid of any unnecessary flourish. He was a man of contradictions, she realized. A warrior, yes, but also a man of quiet contemplation, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. And he had warned her. He had risked his own position, his own safety, to tell her that she was in danger. The question was, why? And from whom? The sound of approaching footsteps startled her. She turned to see the Queen's lady-in-waiting, a severe woman named Agnes, approaching her with a purposeful stride. "Her Majesty requests your presence in her solar," Agnes said, her voice devoid of any warmth. Juliana felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The Queen rarely summoned her unless there was a matter of importance to discuss. And given the events of the morning, Juliana had a sinking feeling that this summons was not going to be pleasant. She followed Agnes through the labyrinthine corridors of the castle, her footsteps echoing on the cold stone floors. The air grew colder, the tapestries on the walls depicting scenes of battles and conquests, adding to the sense of foreboding. As she reached the Queen's solar, a richly appointed chamber filled with the scent of incense and beeswax, Juliana took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. She knew that her life, as she knew it, was about to change. And she had a terrible feeling that Sir Aldrich's warning was only the beginning. The falcon, it seemed, was about to fall. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The Queen's solar was a sanctuary of controlled opulence. Sunlight, filtered through sheer silk curtains, illuminated the room with a soft, golden glow. The air was heavy with the scent of myrrh and frankincense, a fragrance that always seemed to cling to the Queen, a subtle reminder of her piety and power. Tapestries depicting scenes from ancient myths adorned the walls, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the austere stone of the castle. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, chasing away the lingering chill of the late winter air. Queen Isolde sat by the window, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She was a woman of striking beauty, even in her advancing years. Her hair, once the color of raven's wings, was now streaked with silver, but her eyes, a piercing shade of emerald green, still held the same sharp intelligence and unwavering focus. She wore a gown of deep crimson velvet, embroidered with gold thread, a symbol of her royal status and her unwavering authority. Juliana curtsied low, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Your Majesty," she murmured, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor, as was proper. Juliana, the queen said, her voice smooth and melodious, yet edged with a hint of steel.
Come closer.
Juliana obeyed, her silk gown rustling softly as she approached. She could feel the queen's gaze upon her, assessing, evaluating, weighing her worth. It was a sensation she had grown accustomed to, yet it never failed to make her feel like a specimen under a magnifying glass. "You have been summoned," the queen began, her voice taking on a formal tone, "because a decision has been made regarding your future." Juliana's breath caught in her throat.
This was it, then.
The moment she had both dreaded and anticipated. The moment when her fate would be sealed, her future determined by the whims of the crown. "As you know," the queen continued, "you are of marriageable age. And as a ward of the crown, it is my duty and my privilege to ensure that you make a match that is both advantageous to you and beneficial to the realm." Juliana nodded, her mouth dry. She had known this was coming, of course. She had been raised for this, groomed for this. Yet, the reality of it, the finality of it, struck her with a force that she had not anticipated. "Several suitors have expressed their interest," the queen said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Lord Elmsworth, of course, is among them. He is a wealthy man, a loyal subject, and his lands border our own. A union with him would strengthen our position in the south." Juliana suppressed a shudder. Lord Elmsworth, with his lecherous gaze and his clammy hands, was the last man she wanted to marry. He was old enough to be her father, and his reputation for cruelty was well known. "There are others as well," the queen continued, seemingly oblivious to Juliana's silent protest. "Lord Banning, a young and ambitious knight from the Western Marches. He is a skilled warrior, and his family has a long history of service to the crown." Juliana knew of Lord Banning. He was handsome in a rough sort of way, and he had a reputation for bravery. But he was also known for his ruthlessness, his ambition, and his lack of compassion. "And then," the queen said, her voice softening slightly, "there is Sir Aldrich Montrose." Juliana's head snapped up, her eyes widening in surprise. Sir Aldrich? The king's most trusted knight? The man who had warned her to leave Hymir? It was unthinkable. He was a legend, a figure of myth and song, a man far above her station. And he was old. Not as old as Elmsworth, certainly, but old enough to have seen a lifetime of battles, to have witnessed the rise and fall of kings. "Sir Aldrich?" Juliana repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "He has expressed his interest," the queen said, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "He is a man of impeccable honor, of unwavering loyalty. He is the king's closest advisor, his most trusted friend. A union with him would be unprecedented." Juliana was speechless. She couldn't fathom why Sir Aldrich would want to marry her. He could have any woman in the kingdom, any noblewoman with a vast dowry and a powerful family. She was a pawn, a ward of the crown, a girl with no real power or influence. "The king is considering it," the queen said, her voice carefully neutral. "He sees the advantages, of course. But he is also concerned." "Concerned?" Juliana asked, her voice trembling. "Sir Aldrich is a man of complexities," the queen said, choosing her words carefully. "He carries the weight of the past upon his shoulders. He has seen much sorrow, much loss. He is not a man who gives his heart easily." Juliana remembered the sadness in his eyes, the lines of grief etched upon his face. She understood, in that moment, that Sir Aldrich was not the invincible hero of the ballads. He was a man, a human being, burdened by the scars of his past. "He lost his wife many years ago," the queen continued, her voice softening further. "A tragic accident during a hunting expedition. He has never remarried. He has devoted his life to the service of the crown, to the protection of the realm." Juliana felt a pang of sympathy for the knight. She knew what it was like to lose someone you loved, to carry the weight of grief and loneliness. "The king fears that you are not strong enough," the queen said, her gaze piercing. "That you are too fragile, too innocent, to handle the burdens that come with being Sir Aldrich's wife." Juliana's chin lifted. She might be innocent, yes, but she was not weak. She had survived the intrigues of the court, the manipulations of the queen, the constant pressure to conform. She had learned to be resilient, to be resourceful, to hide her true feelings behind a mask of composure. "I am stronger than I appear, Your Majesty," Juliana said, her voice firm. The queen studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps," she said finally.
Perhaps you are.
She paused, then added, with a hint of warning in her voice, "But be warned, Juliana. Sir Aldrich is not a man to be trifled with. He is a man of honor, yes, but he is also a man of secrets. And those secrets could destroy you." The queen's words echoed Sir Aldrich's own warning, reinforcing the sense of impending danger. Juliana felt a shiver run down her spine. She was being offered a choice, a chance to escape the gilded cage of the court, to marry a man of legendary status. But it was a choice fraught with peril, a path shrouded in shadows. "The king will make his decision soon," the queen said, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. "Until then, I suggest you reflect on your options and pray for guidance." Juliana curtsied again, her mind reeling. She left the queen's solar, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She had been given a glimpse into a world beyond the confines of Hymir, a world of power and danger, of love and betrayal. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life was about to change forever. The falcon, it appeared, was falling, and she couldn't see where it would land. The shadows were growing deeper. Chapter 3. The King's Decree. The days following Juliana's audience with the queen were a blur of anxious anticipation and hushed speculation. The court buzzed with rumors, whispers that followed Juliana like a shadow, clinging to the hem of her gown, echoing in the vaulted ceilings of the great hall. The news of Sir Aldrich's unexpected proposal had spread like wildfire, igniting a blaze of gossip and intrigue. Some whispered that it was a love match, a testament to Juliana's hidden charms, a fairy tale romance blossoming in the heart of the Stoic knight. Others claimed it was a political maneuver, a strategic alliance orchestrated by the king to solidify his power and secure the loyalty of his most trusted advisor. Still others whispered of darker motives, of hidden agendas and secret plots, of a pawn being sacrificed on the chessboard of royal ambition. Juliana, caught in the crosscurrents of these swirling rumors, felt increasingly isolated and vulnerable. She found herself avoiding the crowded hallways, seeking refuge in the quiet solitude of the castle gardens or the dimly lit sanctuary of the chapel. She longed to speak to Sir Aldrich, to understand his reasons, to decipher the truth behind his enigmatic proposal. But he remained distant, a figure of granite and steel, his emotions carefully guarded, his intentions shrouded in mystery. She saw him only from afar, during the daily training sessions in the courtyard, or across the vast expanse of the great hall during meals. He moved with the same effortless grace and power that she had always admired, his presence commanding respect and awe. But there was a new tension in his posture, a subtle tightness around his eyes that hinted at the burden he carried. One evening, as she was walking through the gardens, seeking solace in the fading light, she saw him standing by the ancient oak tree that dominated the center of the lawn. He was alone, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, his silhouette outlined against the fiery hues of the setting sun. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Should she approach him? Should she risk breaking the unspoken rules of courtly etiquette, the delicate dance of distance and deference that governed their interactions? But the need to know, the yearning to understand, outweighed her fear. She took a deep breath and walked towards him, her footsteps soft on the dew-kissed grass. He turned as she approached, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, widening slightly in surprise. He hadn't heard her coming, she realized, lost as he was in his own thoughts. "Sir Aldrich," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement, but his expression remained guarded. "Lady Juliana." An awkward silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken questions, unacknowledged emotions. Juliana struggled to find the words, to break through the wall of reserve that he had erected around himself. "I wanted to speak to you," she finally stammered, her voice trembling slightly. About your proposal. His gaze intensified, searching her face, as if trying to decipher her motives, to gauge her sincerity. It is a matter for the king to decide, he said, his voice deep and resonant, yet devoid of any warmth.
But why?
She persisted, her voice gaining strength. Why me? You could have any woman in the kingdom. Why would you choose me? He hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. You are suitable, he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. You are of noble birth, you are pleasing to the eye, and you are a ward of the crown. His words, though polite, felt like a cold slap in the face. He saw her as nothing more than a suitable match, a political asset, a pawn in the game of power. He did not see her, the woman beneath the surface, the woman who yearned for something more than a life of gilded captivity. Is that all? She asked, her voice laced with a hint of bitterness. Am I nothing more than a breeding mare, to be traded for alliances and power? His eyes flickered with a hint of something unreadable surprise, perhaps, or even regret. You are more than that, he said, his voice softening slightly. But this is not a matter of the heart, Lady Juliana. It is a matter of duty, of obligation, of serving the crown. And what of my duty? She challenged, her voice rising. What of my desires? Am I to have no say in my own fate? He looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening, a hint of sadness returning to his eyes. You will have a choice, Lady Juliana, he said quietly. The king will not force you, but I ask you to consider it.
Carefully.
He turned to leave, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. But then he paused, as if remembering something. The king will announce his decision tomorrow, he said, his voice low and urgent. At the feast. Be prepared. And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Juliana alone with her swirling thoughts and her growing sense of dread. The following day dawned bright and clear, the spring sun streaming through the stained glass windows of the great hall, illuminating the scene of opulent festivity. The long tables were laden with food and drink, the air filled with the sounds of music and laughter, the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. The entire court was assembled, dressed in their finest attire, their faces alight with anticipation. Juliana, seated at the high table, next to the queen, felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. She wore a gown of pale gold silk, embroidered with pearls, her hair styled in an elaborate braid that mirrored the queen's own. She looked the part of the perfect noblewoman, the ideal bride, the coveted prize. But beneath the surface of her composure, she was a tempest of conflicting emotions. She had spent the previous night tossing and turning, unable to sleep, her mind replaying her conversation with Sir Aldrich, his words echoing in her ears. She had prayed for guidance, for strength, for a sign, anything to help her make the right decision. But the heavens had remained silent, offering no answers, no solace. And now, the moment of truth had arrived. The king, a tall, imposing figure with a stern face and a crown of silver hair, rose to his feet, his goblet raised in a toast. The hall fell silent, all eyes fixed upon him. My loyal subjects, he began, his voice booming across the room, we are gathered here today to celebrate the coming of spring, the renewal of life, the promise of prosperity. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests, lingering for a moment on Juliana. And we are also gathered here, he continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone, to announce a matter of great importance, a decision that will affect the future of our kingdom. Juliana's heart pounded against her ribs. She could feel the queen's gaze upon her, sharp and unwavering. She could feel the weight of the entire court's expectations, pressing down on her like a physical burden. As you know, the king said, my trusted knight, Sir Aldrich Montrose, has made a proposal of marriage to Lady Juliana of Hymir, a ward of the crown. A murmur rippled through the hall, a wave of whispered speculation and suppressed excitement. Juliana felt her cheeks flush, her hands trembling in her lap. After careful consideration, The king continued, his voice unwavering, and with the full consent of Lady Juliana he paused, his eyes meeting hers, a silent question in their depths. Juliana took a deep breath, steeling herself. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I consent, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and strong, though her heart felt like it was shattering into a million pieces. She would face the shadows, whatever they held. The king's decree had sealed her fate. Chapter 4. A Knight's Burden. The announcement of the betrothal sent a ripple of shock and excitement through the great hall. Gasps and murmurs erupted, followed by a flurry of toasts and congratulations. Juliana, however, felt a profound sense of unreality, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. The king's words, with the full consent of Lady Juliana, echoed in her mind, a stark reminder of the choice she had made, the path she had chosen. She had consented, yes, but not out of love, or desire, or even ambition. She had consented out of a sense of duty, of obligation, of a desperate hope that she could somehow navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life and find a semblance of peace, a measure of protection, within the walls of this unexpected union. Sir Aldrich, standing at the king's side, remained stoic and impassive, his expression betraying no emotion. He acknowledged the toasts with a slight inclination of his head, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, fixed on some distant point beyond the revelry. He looked, Juliana thought, like a man carrying a heavy burden, a weight that no one else could see or understand. After the initial flurry of congratulations had subsided, the feast continued, the music and laughter resuming, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. Juliana, however, found it difficult to partake in the festivities. She picked at her food, her appetite gone, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. She longed to speak to Aldrich, to understand his reasons, to penetrate the wall of reserve that he had erected around himself. But he remained at the king's side, engaged in conversation with various lords and dignitaries, his attention seemingly focused on matters of state. As the evening wore on, Juliana felt a growing sense of isolation and despair. She was surrounded by people, by noise, by celebration, yet she felt utterly alone. She was a pawn, a piece on the chessboard of royal ambition, her fate sealed, her future determined by forces beyond her control. She excused herself from the table, claiming a headache, and slipped away from the crowded hall, seeking refuge in the quiet solitude of the castle corridors. She wandered aimlessly, her footsteps echoing on the cold stone floors, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She found herself drawn to the chapel, the dimly lit sanctuary where she had often sought solace in the past. She entered, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a soft thud, shutting out the noise and chaos of the feast. The chapel was empty, save for the flickering light of the candles that illuminated the altar, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air was cool and still, scented with the faint aroma of incense and beeswax. Juliana knelt at the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, seeking guidance, seeking strength, seeking some semblance of peace in the midst of the storm that raged within her. She prayed for her future, for her marriage, for Sir Aldrich. She prayed for the strength to bear the burdens that lay ahead, the courage to face the unknown, the wisdom to navigate the treacherous waters of courtly life. As she prayed, she heard a soft footstep behind her. She turned, her heart skipping a beat, to see Sir Aldrich standing in the shadows, his tall figure silhouetted against the flickering candlelight. He approached her slowly, his movements silent and graceful, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He knelt beside her, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "I saw you leave the hall," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Are you unwell?" Juliana shook her head. "Just overwhelmed," she whispered. "It is all so sudden." He nodded, his gaze searching her face. "I understand," he said. "It is a significant change." An awkward silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken questions, unacknowledged emotions. Juliana struggled to find the words, to break through the wall of reserve that separated them. "Why me?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. "I told you," he said. "You are suitable. But there must be more," she persisted. "There must be something else." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening, a hint of sadness returning to his eyes. "There are reasons," he said finally, his voice guarded. "Reasons that I cannot fully explain." "Secrets," she said, remembering the Queen's warning. "You have secrets, don't you?" He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "We all have secrets, Lady Juliana," he said quietly. "Some more dangerous than others." "And yours, are they dangerous to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that she couldn't quite decipher. "They could be," he admitted. "But I will protect you. I swear it." His words, though reassuring, sent a shiver down her spine. She believed him. She trusted him, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap, a web of deceit and danger that she couldn't fully comprehend. "I know this is not what you wanted," he said, his voice softening further. "I know you had dreams of a different life." She looked at him, surprised by his perception. "How did you know?" she asked. He smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "I have watched you, Lady Juliana," he said. "I have seen the sadness in your eyes, the yearning for something more." "And what of your dreams?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "What did you want?" His smile faded, replaced by a look of profound sorrow. "My dreams are long dead," he said quietly. "Buried with my wife." He spoke of his late wife with a tenderness, a reverence, that touched Juliana's heart. She understood, in that moment, that he was not a cold, unfeeling man, as she had initially believed. He was a man who had loved deeply and lost tragically, and who had built a wall around his heart to protect himself from further pain. "I will not ask you to love me," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know that is not possible. But I will respect you. I will honor you. And I will protect you. With my life." His words, spoken with such sincerity, such conviction, moved Juliana deeply. She saw, in that moment, not a fearsome knight, not a political pawn, but a man of honor, a man of integrity, a man who was offering her the only thing he could, his protection, his loyalty, his unwavering commitment. She reached out, her hand hesitantly touching his. His skin was warm and rough, callous from years of wielding a sword. He looked at her, his eyes questioning, surprised by her gesture. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I will try to be a good wife to you, Sir Aldrich. I will try to live up to your expectations." He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "You already have, Lady Juliana," he said quietly. "You already have." He stood, offering her his hand. She took it, and he helped her to her feet. Their fingers lingered for a moment, a silent connection, a fragile bond forming between them. The burden, though still there, felt a little lighter. The night felt human. Chapter 5. The Falcon's Flight. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity. The castle was abuzz with preparations, seamstresses working tirelessly to create Juliana's wedding gown, cooks preparing elaborate feasts, and servants polishing every surface until it gleamed. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, spices, and anticipation. Guests arrived from all corners of the kingdom, filling the castle with their laughter, their gossip, and their insatiable curiosity about the unlikely union between the king's most trusted knight and the queen's ward. Juliana, however, felt increasingly detached from the festivities. She moved through the preparations like a ghost, her mind preoccupied with the weight of her impending marriage, the uncertainty of her future, and the lingering mystery surrounding Sir Aldrich. She had seen little of him since their encounter in the chapel. He remained busy with his duties, advising the king, overseeing the training of the knights, and preparing for the upcoming spring tournament. He treated her with a distant courtesy, a respectful formality that kept her at arm's length, preventing any further intimacy or understanding. She tried to tell herself that this was for the best, that it was safer to maintain a distance, to avoid any emotional entanglements. But she couldn't deny the growing curiosity she felt about him, the yearning to understand the man behind the mask of the stoic knight, the secrets that haunted his eyes. She found herself drawn to the falconry, a pastime she had always enjoyed, but had neglected in recent years. The castle's falconer, a wizened old man named Thomas, welcomed her with a knowing smile, sensing her need for solace and escape. She spent hours in the mews, tending to the birds, learning their names, their personalities, their individual quirks. She found a particular affinity for a young peregrine falcon, a fierce and independent creature with sharp eyes and powerful wings. She named her Shadow, after the recurring dream that had haunted her for so long. One afternoon, as she was training Shadow in the courtyard, she saw Sir Aldrich watching her from the battlements above. He stood there for a long moment, his tall figure silhouetted against the bright blue sky, his expression unreadable. She felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach, a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She continued to work with Shadow, guiding the falcon through a series of intricate maneuvers, demonstrating her skill and her control. As Shadow soared through the air, circling high above the castle, Juliana felt a sense of freedom, a release from the constraints of courtly life, the weight of her impending marriage. She felt connected to the falcon, to the wildness, the untamed spirit that resonated within her own soul. Suddenly, Shadow let out a sharp cry and plummeted towards the ground, her wings beating erratically. Juliana's heart leaped into her throat. She had seen this before, in her dream, the falcon falling, broken and bloodied. She ran towards the spot where Shadow had landed, her fear growing with each step. She found the falcon lying on the grass, her wing twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes glazed with pain. Juliana knelt beside her, gently stroking her feathers, her heart aching with compassion. She examined the injured wing, her fingers probing for broken bones. She knew she had to act quickly, to splint the wing and get Shadow back to the mews for treatment. As she was working, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. She looked up to see Sir Aldrich striding towards her, his face etched with concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice urgent. She fell," Juliana said, her voice trembling. "Her wing, I think it's broken." Aldrich knelt beside her, his gaze fixed on the injured falcon. He examined the wing with a practiced eye, his touch surprisingly gentle. "It is broken," he confirmed, his voice grim. "But it can be mended." He looked at Juliana, his eyes meeting hers. "You have a gift," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and surprise. "You have a way with these creatures." Juliana blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her cheeks. She had never received such praise from him before, such a genuine acknowledgement of her skills. I learned from Thomas," she stammered. "He taught me everything I know." "He taught you well," Aldrich said. "But you have something more. A connection. A compassion." He helped her to splint Shadow's wing, his hands working alongside hers, their fingers brushing occasionally, sending a shiver of awareness through her. She was struck by his gentleness, his care, his unexpected tenderness towards the injured bird. They carried Shadow back to the mews together, Aldrich cradling the falcon in his arms, Juliana walking beside him, her heart filled with a confusing mixture of emotions. She felt a growing sense of connection to him, a bond forged in shared concern, shared compassion, shared something else. Something that she couldn't quite name, but that felt both dangerous and exhilarating. As Thomas worked and set the wing properly, Juliana and Aldrich waited. They sat in silence near the injured falcon, but it was not an awkward quiet. It was a waiting, a shared feeling, a breath held until the next. It bound them together, even with the expanse between them, even with the secrets that lay between. The moment held a promise of something more, something deeper. Something she suspected that was far more than she imagined. Chapter 6. Hidden Truths. The days dwindled, marked by the frenetic pace of wedding preparations and Juliana's quiet moments tending to Shadow, whose wing was slowly mending. The falcon's recovery mirrored Juliana's own tentative steps towards accepting her new reality, a reality inextricably linked to Sir Aldrich Montrose. While the court buzzed with excitement, Juliana found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet corners of the castle, seeking solace and understanding, away from the prying eyes and endless whispers. One evening, she found herself in the castle library, a vast, cavernous room filled with ancient tomes and dusty scrolls. The air was cool and still, scented with the faint aroma of leather and parchment. She had always loved the library, finding comfort in the silent companionship of books, the wisdom of ages past. She was browsing the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of the ancient volumes, when she stumbled upon a hidden alcove, concealed behind a tapestry depicting the history of Hymir. Curiosity piqued, she pushed aside the tapestry and stepped into the small, secret chamber. The alcove was dimly lit by a single window, its stained glass casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the stone floor. The air was thick with dust, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. In the center of the room stood a small, wooden chest, its surface intricately carved with scenes of knights and dragons, falcons and forests. Juliana felt a strange pull towards the chest, a sense of familiarity, as if she had seen it before, perhaps in a dream. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch, her mind filled with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. She knew she shouldn't be here, that she was trespassing, that she was risking the wrath of the queen, perhaps even the king. But the lure of the unknown, the promise of hidden truths, was too strong to resist. She lifted the latch and opened the chest, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a collection of objects, carefully wrapped in silk and velvet. A silver locket, engraved with a falcon in flight, its wings spread wide. A small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with elegant script, written in a language she didn't recognize. A lock of golden hair, tied with a faded ribbon. And a letter, sealed with the crest of a family she didn't know a serpent coiled around a rose. Juliana carefully unwrapped the objects, her fingers trembling with anticipation. She opened the locket, revealing a miniature portrait of a beautiful woman, with golden hair and gray eyes, strikingly similar to her own. She recognized the woman, with a jolt of shock, as the woman from her dreams, the woman who had haunted her sleep for so long. She opened the leather-bound book, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar script. She couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the handwriting, the elegant loops and flourishes, as the same as the writing on the letter. She picked up the lock of hair, its golden strands soft and silky against her fingertips. She felt a strange connection to it, a sense of kinship, as if she were holding a piece of herself. Finally, she picked up the letter, her heart pounding with a sense of dread and anticipation. She broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, her eyes scanning the elegant script. The letter was written in the same unfamiliar language as the book, but as she read, she began to understand, to decipher the meaning, as if the words were speaking to her from across the ages. The letter was addressed to a woman named Lyra, from a man named Kalen. It was a love letter, filled with passion, with longing, with a desperate plea for forgiveness. As Juliana read further, she realized, with a growing sense of horror, that Lyra was her mother and Kalen was Sir Aldrich Montrose. The letter revealed a secret love affair, a forbidden passion that had blossomed between the foreign princess and the king's most trusted knight. It spoke of stolen moments, of secret rendezvous, of a love that had dared to defy the boundaries of duty and obligation. It also spoke of betrayal, of a plot to overthrow the king, of a conspiracy that had been discovered, leading to Lyra's death, officially declared a hunting accident, but, in truth, a carefully orchestrated assassination. Juliana's world shattered around her. The pieces of the puzzle, the fragments of her past, the whispers and rumors, the warnings and secrets, all fell into place, revealing a truth so devastating, so terrifying, that she could barely comprehend it. Her mother had not died in an accident. She had been murdered, and Sir Aldrich, he had been her lover. He had been involved in a plot against the king. He had betrayed the crown, the very institution he had sworn to protect. Juliana felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She sank to the floor, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She clutched the letter to her chest, her tears blurring the elegant script, the words of love and betrayal mingling with her own grief and despair. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her own private hell, the weight of the truth crushing her, suffocating her. She only knew that her life, as she knew it, was over. She had agreed to marry a man who had been her mother's lover, a man who had been implicated in her death, a man who carried secrets so dangerous, so deadly, that they could destroy her. She heard a noise behind her, a soft footstep. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear, to see Sir Aldrich standing in the doorway of the alcove, his face pale, his expression a mixture of shock and guilt. He had found her. He knew that she knew. The hidden truths were out, and Juliana did not know where they would lead. Chapter 7. The Tournament of Lies. Aldrich's face was a mask of controlled shock. The color drained from his weathered features, leaving him looking older, more vulnerable than Juliana had ever seen him. The air in the hidden alcove crackled with unspoken accusations, with the weight of revealed secrets, with the shattered remnants of Juliana's carefully constructed reality. "Juliana," he said, his voice a low, strained whisper, his gaze fixed on the letter clutched in her trembling hands. How did you find this?" She didn't answer, her eyes locked on his, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of remorse, any flicker of the man she thought she was beginning to understand. She simply held up the letter, the damning evidence of his past, of his betrayal, of his connection to her mother's death. He took a step towards her, his hand outstretched, as if to take the letter, to erase the truth, to silence the ghosts of the past. But then, he hesitated, his hand falling back to his side, his gaze dropping to the floor. I can explain," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's not what you think." "Then, what is it?" she challenged, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger, grief, and a profound sense of betrayal. Tell me the truth." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, as if struggling to find the words, to unravel the tangled web of lies and deceit that had defined his life for so long. "Your mother, Lyra, he began, his voice faltering. "She was the love of my life." The words, spoken with such raw emotion, such aching tenderness, pierced Juliana's heart. She had known, of course, from the letter, that they had been lovers. But to hear him say it, to see the grief etched on his face, to feel the depth of his loss, brought the reality of their relationship crashing down upon her with a force that took her breath away. "We met before she was married to the king," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "It was a forbidden love, a dangerous love, but we couldn't stay away from each other." He told her the story of their secret rendezvous, of their stolen moments, of their desperate hope that they could somehow find a way to be together, despite the insurmountable obstacles that stood in their way. He told her of the plot, not to overthrow the king, as she had initially believed, but to expose the corruption within the court, the treachery of the queen's advisors, who were secretly plotting to seize power for themselves. He told her of how Lyra had discovered the plot, of how she had risked her life to warn the king, of how she had been betrayed, not by him, but by one of the queen's spies, who had discovered their affair and used it to silence her, to frame her for treason, to arrange her accident. "I tried to save her," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I tried to warn her, but it was too late." He told her of his grief, of his despair, of his vow to avenge her death, to expose the truth, to bring the real traitors to justice. He had spent the years since her death working from within, gathering evidence, building alliances, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the marriage?" Juliana asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you propose to me?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "At first it was a way to protect you," he said. "I knew the queen suspected you. I knew she saw you as a threat. I thought if I married you, I could keep you safe. And now? She asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He hesitated, his gaze searching her face. Now it's more than that, he admitted, his voice low and earnest. I care for you, Juliana. I admire your strength, your courage, your compassion. I see her in you. His words, though spoken with sincerity, sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know what to believe, what to trust. She was torn between her grief for her mother, her anger at his betrayal, and a growing something else. A reluctant admiration, a grudging respect, and a flicker of attraction. The tournament, he said, changing the subject abruptly. It starts tomorrow. It's a dangerous time. The queen she will be watching. We must be careful. The annual spring tournament was a grand spectacle, a display of knightly prowess and courtly pageantry. Knights from across the kingdom would compete in a series of justs, melees, and archery contests, vying for glory, for honor, and for the favor of the king and queen. But this year, Juliana knew, the tournament would be more than just a game. It would be a stage for political maneuvering, for hidden agendas, for the unfolding of a deadly plot that had been brewing for years. She looked at Aldrich, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. What do we do? She asked. He met her gaze, his own unwavering. We play the game, he said. We pretend. We wait. And we strike when the time is right. The tournament began the next day, under a bright spring sky, the air filled with the sounds of trumpets and drums, the cheers of the crowd, the clash of steel on steel. Juliana, seated in the royal box beside the queen, watched the spectacle unfold, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It was a macabre play of deception, everyone acting a part. Aldrich, resplendent in his armor, his family crest a silver falcon on a field of blue emblazoned on his shield, rode into the arena, his presence commanding respect and awe. He was a formidable warrior, his skills honed by years of battle, his movements precise and economical, his every strike deadly. He won his first joust, unseating his opponent with a single, powerful blow. He won his second and his third, his victories drawing cheers from the crowd and a grudging smile from the king. But Juliana knew that the real battle was not being fought on the tournament field. It was being fought in the shadows, in the whispered conversations, in the hidden glances, in the subtle manipulations of the queen and her allies. She watched the queen, her face a mask of serene composure, her eyes sharp and calculating as she observed the proceedings, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the knights, calculating the odds, plotting her next move. Juliana knew that she was a pawn in the queen's game, a piece to be moved and manipulated, a tool to be used and discarded. But she was no longer a passive pawn. She was aware of the game, of the players, of the stakes. And she was determined to play her part, to fight for her own survival, to protect the man she was beginning to care for. Even in this tournament of lies, truth was surfacing. Chapter 8. Beneath the Surface. The tournament continued for days, a relentless cycle of justs, melees, and archery contests. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and horses, the sounds of clashing steel and cheering crowds a constant backdrop to the unfolding drama. Juliana, forced to maintain the facade of a dutifully betrothed noblewoman, found the strain almost unbearable. Every smile was a lie, every polite conversation a carefully constructed deception. She watched Aldrich, his performances in the arena a mixture of genuine skill and calculated strategy. He needed to win, not just for the honor, but to maintain his position, to keep the king's favor, to avoid arousing suspicion. He moved with a grace and power that belied the weight of the secrets he carried, the burden of his past, the danger of his present. She found herself drawn to him, despite her fear, despite her lingering doubts, despite the knowledge of his past involvement with her mother. She saw beyond the stoic knight, beyond the legendary warrior, to the man beneath the surface, the man who had loved and lost, the man who was fighting for justice, for redemption, for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. They had stolen moments, brief encounters in the castle corridors, whispered conversations in the dead of night, their connection deepening with each shared glance, each shared secret. He told her more about his past, about his life before Lyra, about his years of service to the crown, about his unwavering loyalty to the king, despite the king's own complicity in the queen's machinations. He explained that the king was not a cruel man, but a weak one, easily manipulated by the queen, blinded by his love for her, unable to see the darkness that lurked beneath her beautiful surface. He had been aware of the rumors surrounding Lyra's death, but he had chosen to believe the official story, to bury his doubts, to maintain the stability of the realm. Aldrich's plan, he revealed, was to expose the queen's treachery during the tournament, to present the king with irrefutable evidence of her crimes, to force him to choose between his love for his wife and his duty to his kingdom. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble, with the potential for devastating consequences. Juliana, initially horrified by the deception, by the danger, found herself drawn into his plan, her loyalty shifting, her own sense of justice awakened. She was no longer a passive pawn, a victim of circumstance. She was an active participant, a willing accomplice, a woman determined to fight for her own future and for the man she was beginning to love. She began to gather information, using her position as the queen's ward to her advantage, listening to the whispers, observing the interactions, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. She discovered a network of spies, loyal to the queen, operating within the castle, gathering information, manipulating events, silencing dissent. She learned of secret meetings, of coded messages, of a plot to assassinate Aldrich during the final joust, to make it look like an accident, to remove the last obstacle to the queen's complete control of the kingdom. She shared her findings with Aldrich, their collaboration strengthening their bond, their trust deepening with each shared risk, each shared secret. They worked together, carefully, cautiously, laying their own traps, preparing their own counter-moves, determined to outwit the queen, to expose her treachery, to bring her to justice. One evening, as they were meeting in secret, in the hidden alcove where Juliana had discovered the truth about her mother, Aldrich took her hand, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her. "Juliana," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I know I have asked much of you. I have put you in danger. I have burdened you with my past." She looked at him, her eyes meeting his, her heart filled with a confusing mixture of emotions. "I chose this," she said, her voice firm. "I am not afraid." He smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "You are remarkable," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You are stronger than you know." He leaned closer, his gaze fixed on her lips. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should pull away, that it was dangerous, that it was reckless, that it was forbidden. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, irresistibly, magnetically, her body yearning for his touch, her heart aching for his affection. He kissed her, his lips soft and gentle at first, then more demanding, more passionate, as if he were pouring all his pent-up emotions, all his grief, all his longing, into that single, desperate act. She responded, her own passion igniting, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his, as if she were trying to merge with him, to become one with him, to erase the past, to forget the danger, to lose herself in the moment. The kiss lasted for an eternity, and yet it was over too soon. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in unison. I shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was wrong." "No," she said, her voice trembling. "It was right. It was what I wanted." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and regret. I cannot offer you a future, Juliana," he said. "I cannot promise you happiness. I am a marked man." "I don't care," she said, her voice fierce. "I don't want a future without you." The surface was shattered. The kiss, the moment, revealed everything. And she was ready to meet it. Chapter 9. A stolen moment. The aftermath of the kiss hung between them, a shimmering, unspoken tension that permeated every stolen glance, every whispered conversation. The danger surrounding them seemed to intensify, amplified by the newly awakened emotions that neither of them could deny. The tournament, with its pageantry and violence, felt like a distant echo, a backdrop to the real drama unfolding in the secret spaces of Hymir Castle. Juliana found herself increasingly torn between her duty, her fear, and the undeniable pull she felt towards Aldrich. She knew he was right. He couldn't offer her a future, not a conventional one, not one free from danger and uncertainty. But the thought of a life without him, a life of gilded captivity, a life devoid of the passion and purpose she had found in his arms, was unbearable. They continued to meet in secret, their stolen moments becoming more frequent, more intense, more desperate. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams, their vulnerabilities, forging a bond that transcended the boundaries of their circumstances, the constraints of their society, the weight of their past. One afternoon, they found themselves in the castle gardens, hidden amidst the blossoming rose bushes, the air thick with the scent of flowers and the drone of bees. They had managed to slip away from the watchful eyes of the court, seeking a few precious moments of solitude, a brief respite from the relentless pressure of the tournament and the ever-present threat of the queen. Aldrich took her hand, his touch sending a familiar shiver of warmth through her. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and longing, a reflection of her own emotions. "Juliana," he said, his voice low and husky, I have been thinking." She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was going to say. She had been anticipating it, dreading it, yearning for it. "We cannot continue like this," he said, his voice strained. "It is too dangerous. For you." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She knew he was right, that their stolen moments were a reckless gamble, that they were risking everything, their lives, their reputations, their futures. "But I don't want to stop," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't want to lose you." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he were trying to shield her from the world, from the danger, from the inevitable heartbreak. "I don't want to lose you either," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I cannot let you sacrifice your life for me. You deserve more. You deserve happiness." "You are my happiness," she said, her voice fierce. "You are everything." He kissed her then, a long, slow, passionate kiss that sealed their fate, that bound them together, that defied the world, that declared their love, despite the odds, despite the danger, despite the certainty of loss. They stayed there, in the hidden embrace of the rose bushes, for as long as they dared, savoring the stolen moment, cherishing the fleeting connection, knowing that it might be their last. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the gardens, they reluctantly pulled apart, their hearts heavy with the weight of their unspoken farewell. "We must be careful," Aldrich said, his voice urgent. "The final joust is tomorrow. The queen, she will be watching. We must be ready." Juliana nodded, her eyes meeting his, her own filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that the coming day would be the most dangerous yet, that it would test their courage, their loyalty, their love, to the very limit. They returned to the castle separately, their hearts heavy with the unspoken knowledge that their stolen moment might be their last. The air was thick with anticipation, with tension, with the sense that the carefully constructed facade of courtly life was about to shatter, revealing the raw, brutal truth that lay beneath. As Juliana prepared for bed, she found a small, velvet pouch tucked beneath her pillow. She opened it, her fingers trembling, to find a single, perfect rose, its petals still damp with dew, and a small, silver locket, the same locket she had found in the hidden alcove, the locket containing the portrait of her mother. She clutched the locket to her chest, her tears falling onto the smooth, cool metal. She knew it was a gift from Aldrich, a token of his love, a reminder of their connection, a symbol of their shared past, and a promise of a future, however uncertain. The stolen moment, though brief, would remain. Chapter 10. The Price of Loyalty. The day of the final joust dawned gray and ominous, the sky heavy with the threat of rain, mirroring the turbulent emotions churning within Juliana. The air crackled with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation and dread hanging over the castle. The crowds gathered early, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension, eager to witness the culmination of the tournament, the final clash between the kingdom's finest knights. Juliana, seated in the royal box beside the queen, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She wore a gown of deep blue, the color of Aldrich's family crest, a subtle act of defiance, a silent declaration of her allegiance. She tried to maintain a facade of composure, of polite indifference, but her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembled in her lap, her gaze constantly searching for Aldrich, for any sign that he was safe, that he was ready. The queen, as always, was a picture of serene elegance, her face a mask of inscrutable calm, her eyes sharp and calculating as she observed the proceedings, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the remaining knights, plotting her next move. She had been unusually attentive to Juliana in the days leading up to the final joust, her smiles more frequent, her questions more probing, her scrutiny more intense. Juliana knew that the queen suspected her, that she was aware of her growing attachment to Aldrich, that she saw her as a potential threat, a loose end that needed to be tied. Aldrich rode into the arena, resplendent in his armor, his silver falcon gleaming on his shield, his presence commanding respect and awe. He looked calm, confident, his eyes scanning the crowd, lingering for a moment on Juliana, a silent message of reassurance, of love, of determination. His opponent was Sir Kester, a formidable knight, loyal to the queen, known for his ruthlessness and his ambition. He was a large, brutal man, his armor stained with the blood of previous battles, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. Juliana knew that he had been chosen by the queen, that he had been given instructions, that he was not just fighting for glory, but for the opportunity to eliminate Aldrich, to silence him forever. The joust began, the trumpets blaring, the drums pounding, the crowd roaring their approval. The two knights charged at each other, their lances lowered, their horses thundering across the field. The impact was deafening, the sound of splintering wood and crashing metal echoing across the arena. Aldrich's lance struck true, hitting Kester squarely in the chest, unseating him with a force that sent him sprawling to the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers, their applause deafening, their excitement palpable. But Juliana felt a chill run down her spine. It had been too easy. Kester had barely put up a fight. He had allowed himself to be unseated, to be defeated. It was a trap. As Aldrich rode towards the fallen knight, offering him a hand to help him up, as was customary, Kester suddenly lunged, drawing a dagger from his boot, his eyes filled with a murderous rage. Juliana screamed, a wordless cry of terror that was lost in the roar of the crowd. She saw Aldrich react, his movements swift and instinctive, deflecting the dagger with his gauntlet, the blade glancing off his armor, drawing a thin line of blood. The crowd gasped, their cheers turning to cries of alarm, their excitement replaced by horror. The king rose to his feet, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. The queen, however, remained seated, her expression unchanged, her gaze fixed on the unfolding drama, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Aldrich, enraged by the treachery, dismounted his horse, drawing his sword, his movements fluid and graceful, yet deadly. Kester, still on the ground, scrambled to his feet, his dagger raised, his face contorted with hatred. They fought, their swords clashing in a furious dance of death, the air filled with the clang of steel, the grunts of exertion, the cries of the crowd. Aldrich was clearly the superior swordsman, his skills honed by years of battle, his movements precise and economical, his every strike calculated to disarm, to incapacitate, to kill. But Kester was driven by a desperate rage, fueled by the queen's promise of reward, by his own ambition, by his hatred for Aldrich, for everything he represented. He fought with a reckless abandon, his attacks wild and unpredictable, his strength fueled by a primal fury. Juliana watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She felt helpless, unable to intervene, unable to protect the man she loved, her fate inextricably linked to his, her future hanging in the balance. Suddenly, Kester lunged, his dagger finding a gap in Aldrich's armor, piercing his side, drawing a cry of pain from the night. Juliana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Aldrich staggered, his hand clutching his wounded side, his face pale, his expression grim. But he did not fall. He stood his ground, his sword still raised, his eyes fixed on his opponent, his determination unwavering. He fought on, his movements slower, his strength fading, but his spirit unbroken. He parried, he thrust, he dodged, his every move a testament to his courage, his skill, his unwavering loyalty to the king, to the kingdom, to her. Finally, with a desperate lunge, he disarmed Kester, his sword knocking the dagger from his hand, sending it spinning across the ground. He stood over the fallen knight, his sword raised, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pity. He could have killed him. He had every right, every justification. Kester had tried to murder him. He had betrayed the code of chivalry. He had served the queen's treachery. But Aldrich hesitated. He lowered his sword, his gaze shifting to the king, seeking his judgment, his command. The king, his face still pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and understanding, slowly shook his head. "Enough," he said, his voice hoarse. "No more bloodshed." Aldrich nodded, his gaze returning to Kester, his expression hardening. "You are banished," he said, his voice cold and clear. "From Hymir, from the kingdom, never to return." Kester, defeated, humiliated, his ambition thwarted, his treachery exposed, slowly rose to his feet, his eyes filled with hatred, his face contorted with rage. He spat on the ground, a gesture of defiance, of contempt, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the crowd, his fate sealed, his future destroyed. The price of loyalty had been almost too high, but the first step had been taken. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Stone. The aftermath of the joust was a chaotic mix of relief, outrage, and hushed speculation. The king, visibly shaken by Kester's treachery, ordered an immediate investigation, his trust in the queen's advisor shattered, his faith in his own judgment deeply shaken. The court buzzed with rumors, whispers of conspiracy, accusations of betrayal, the carefully constructed facade of loyalty and obedience crumbling under the weight of revealed secrets. Juliana, her emotions a whirlwind of relief at Aldrich's survival, fear for his safety, and anger at the queen's treachery, sought refuge in the quiet solitude of the castle gardens. She needed time to process the events of the day, to gather her thoughts, to steel herself for the inevitable confrontation that lay ahead. Aldrich, his wound treated by the royal physician, was confined to his chambers, his movements restricted, his strength slowly returning. He had sent her a message, a single word, "Wait," scrawled on a scrap of parchment, delivered by a trusted servant. She knew what he meant. Wait for the dust to settle. Wait for the king to make his move. Wait for the opportune moment to strike. As she wandered through the gardens, her footsteps echoing on the stone paths, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions, she found herself drawn to the ancient oak tree, the same tree where she had first spoken to Aldrich about his proposal, the same tree that had witnessed so many secrets, so many betrayals, so many whispered promises. She sat beneath the tree, her back resting against its rough bark, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, the sky still gray and ominous, the threat of rain still lingering in the air. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart, to quiet her troubled mind, to find some semblance of peace in the midst of the storm. As she sat there, she heard a faint sound, a whisper of voices, carried on the wind. She opened her eyes, her senses alert, her body tensing. She listened carefully, trying to decipher the words, to identify the speakers. The voices were coming from behind the tree, from a hidden alcove, concealed by a thick growth of ivy. She recognized one of the voices as belonging to the queen, her tone low and urgent, her words laced with a hint of desperation. The other voice was unfamiliar, a man's voice, deep and resonant, yet tinged with a subtle menace. Juliana rose to her feet, her curiosity piqued, her instincts warning her of danger. She crept towards the alcove, her movements silent and cautious, her heart pounding in her chest. She peered through the ivy, her eyes widening in shock, her breath catching in her throat. The queen was standing in the alcove, her back to Juliana, her body tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was speaking to a man, a tall, imposing figure with dark hair and piercing eyes, a man Juliana had never seen before. He was dressed in foreign garb, his clothing richly embroidered, his demeanor arrogant, his presence radiating power and danger. "You promised me results," the queen was saying, her voice sharp and demanding. "Kester failed. Montrose still lives." "Patience, your majesty," the man said, his voice smooth and persuasive, yet laced with a hint of mockery. "These things take time. We have other options." "Options?" the queen repeated, her voice rising in anger. "I am running out of options. The king he suspects. He is questioning everything. He is listening to Montrose." "Then we must silence Montrose," the man said, his voice cold and calculating. "Permanently." "And the girl?" the queen asked, her voice trembling slightly.
She knows too much.
"She is a threat. She is irrelevant," the man said, his voice dismissive.
A pawn.
Easily disposed of. Juliana felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard enough. She knew she had to get away, to warn Aldrich, to expose the queen's treachery, to save their lives. She turned to leave, her movements swift and silent, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she stepped back, her foot caught on a loose stone, sending a small pebble skittering across the path. The queen whirled around, her eyes widening in alarm, her gaze fixed on Juliana's hiding place. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. Juliana froze, her body paralyzed with fear, her mind racing. She knew she had been discovered, that she was trapped, that her life was in imminent danger. The man stepped forward, his hand reaching for the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning the shadows, his expression menacing. "Show yourself," he ordered, his voice harsh and unforgiving. Juliana knew she had no choice. She stepped out from behind the ivy, her body trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. The queen gasped, her face paling, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Juliana," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You heard everything," Juliana said, her voice firm, despite her fear. "I heard everything." The man stepped towards her, his sword drawn, his eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory light. "You will tell no one," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Or you will suffer the consequences." Juliana stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes meeting his, her gaze unwavering. "I will tell everyone," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will expose your treachery. I will destroy you." The queen stepped forward, her hand outstretched, as if to restrain the man, to silence Juliana, to prevent the inevitable confrontation. But it was too late. The man lunged, his sword flashing in the dim light, his intent clear, his target Juliana. She braced herself for the impact. It was all over. The echoes of the stone, the secrets, had revealed a depth she couldn't have imagined. Chapter 12. The Serpent's Kiss. Before the foreign assassin's blade could reach Juliana, a figure erupted from the shadows, a blur of steel and fury. Aldrich, his face a mask of righteous anger, his injured side forgotten, intercepted the blow, his own sword meeting the assassin's with a deafening clang. The force of the impact sent the assassin staggering back, his eyes widening in surprise, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to startled alarm. He had not expected resistance, had not anticipated Aldrich's presence, had underestimated the knight's speed and skill, even in his wounded state. "Juliana, run!" Aldrich shouted, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on his opponent, his body shielding Juliana from harm. But Juliana didn't run. She stood her ground, her fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline, her determination fueled by a fierce protectiveness towards the man she loved. She would not leave him to face this danger alone. The queen, her face a mask of shock and horror, watched the scene unfold, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her, her treachery exposed, her power crumbling. She had underestimated them both, had underestimated Juliana's courage, had underestimated Aldrich's loyalty, had underestimated the strength of their bond. The two men fought, their swords clashing in a furious dance of death, the air filled with the clang of steel, the grunts of exertion, the sharp intake of breath. Aldrich, despite his injury, fought with a ferocity born of desperation, fueled by his love for Juliana, by his need to protect her, by his desire for justice. The assassin, a skilled and seasoned warrior, fought with a cold, calculating precision, his movements fluid and graceful, his attacks relentless and unforgiving. He was clearly the stronger of the two, his strength unimpaired, his movements unhindered, his determination fueled by the promise of reward, by the threat of failure, by the darkness that consumed him. Juliana watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She felt helpless, unable to intervene, unable to assist Aldrich, her fate inextricably linked to his, her future hanging in the balance. Suddenly, the assassin lunged, his sword finding a gap in Aldrich's defense, piercing his shoulder, drawing a cry of pain from the night. Juliana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Aldrich staggered, his hand clutching his wounded shoulder, his face pale, his expression grim. But he did not fall. He stood his ground, his sword still raised, his eyes fixed on his opponent, his determination unwavering. He fought on, his movements slower, his strength fading, but his spirit unbroken. He parried, he thrust, he dodged, his every move a testament to his courage, his skill, his unwavering love. As the fight wore on, Juliana saw an opportunity. The assassin, focused on Aldrich, had left his back exposed. She picked up a large stone from the garden path, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She knew it was a desperate gamble, a reckless act, but she had to do something, anything, to help Aldrich, to save his life. She crept closer, her movements silent and cautious, her eyes fixed on the assassin's back. She waited for the right moment, her muscles tense, her breath held, her mind focused. As the assassin lunged again, his sword aimed at Aldrich's heart, Juliana struck. She hurled the stone with all her might, hitting the assassin squarely in the back of the head, with a sickening thud. The assassin staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, his expression shifting from focused aggression to stunned confusion. He turned, his gaze locking on Juliana, his face contorted with rage. Aldrich, seizing the opportunity, lunged forward, his sword piercing the assassin's heart, silencing him forever. The assassin collapsed to the ground, his body lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the sky, his treachery ended, his threat extinguished. Aldrich stood over him, his chest heaving, his sword dripping with blood, his face pale, his expression a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and gratitude. He looked at Juliana, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that words could not express. He reached out to her, his hand trembling, his touch gentle, his gaze filled with love, with admiration, with awe. "You saved me," he said, his voice hoarse, his breath ragged. Juliana rushed to him, her arms wrapping around him, holding him tight, as if she were afraid he would disappear, as if she were trying to hold him together, to keep him from falling apart. I couldn't let him hurt you," she said, her voice choked with emotion, her tears falling onto his blood-stained tunic. The queen, witnessing the scene, her face a mask of despair, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret, slowly backed away, her movements silent and cautious, her escape unnoticed, her future uncertain, her power gone. She was a serpent, cornered and venomous. Aldrich held Juliana close, his body trembling, his strength fading, his wounds bleeding. He knew he needed help, that he needed to get to safety, that he needed to survive. The kiss, though from a serpent, had been deflected. Chapter 13. A desperate plea. The immediate aftermath of the assassin's death was a blur of frantic activity. Juliana, her fear for Aldrich overriding any concern for her own safety, screamed for help, her cries echoing through the gardens, shattering the illusion of tranquility, summoning the castle guards. The guards arrived, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion, their swords drawn, their eyes scanning the scene, assessing the threat, trying to make sense of the chaos. They found Juliana, her gown torn and stained with blood, cradling Aldrich's wounded body, his armor dented and bloodied, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The queen was nowhere to be seen, her escape unnoticed amidst the confusion, her absence adding another layer of mystery to the already unfolding drama. The guards, initially hesitant, their loyalty divided, their training conflicting with the evidence before their eyes, eventually responded to Juliana's desperate pleas, recognizing the urgency of the situation, the severity of Aldrich's wounds. They carried Aldrich to his chambers, Juliana following close behind, her hand gripping his, her eyes fixed on his face, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The royal physician was summoned, his face grim, his movements swift and efficient. As he examined Aldrich's wounds, his prognosis uncertain, his silence adding to Juliana's growing anxiety. The king, alerted to the commotion, arrived, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. He demanded answers, his voice booming through the chamber, his authority shaken, his trust betrayed, his world turned upside down. Juliana, her voice trembling, her body exhausted, but her spirit unbroken, told him everything. She recounted the events of the tournament, Kester's treachery, the queen's involvement, the assassin's attack, Aldrich's bravery, her own desperate act. She showed him the letter, the evidence of Aldrich's past relationship with her mother, the proof of the queen's plot, the confirmation of her long-held suspicions. She spared no detail, omitted no truth, her words raw and honest, her emotions unfiltered, her plea desperate. The king listened, his face growing paler with each revelation, his eyes widening in disbelief, his hands clenching into fists, his body trembling with a mixture of rage, grief, and betrayal. He had been blind, he realized, blinded by his love for the queen, blinded by his own naivety, blinded by his refusal to see the truth, to acknowledge the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect world. He had trusted the wrong people, had ignored the warnings, had dismissed the rumors, had allowed himself to be manipulated, to be deceived, to be betrayed. He looked at Aldrich, lying unconscious on the bed, his life hanging in the balance, his loyalty unquestionable, his courage undeniable, his sacrifice heartbreaking. He looked at Juliana, her face stained with tears, her body trembling with exhaustion, her spirit unbroken, her love for Aldrich evident in every glance, in every touch, in every word. He knew what he had to do. He ordered the immediate arrest of the queen, his voice cold and resolute, his authority restored, his judgment clear, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He dispatched a contingent of guards to search the castle, to find her, to bring her to justice, to answer for her crimes. He then turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and remorse. "You saved him," he said, his voice hoarse, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, a gesture of fatherly affection, a silent apology for his past failures, for his blindness, for his weakness. "He saved me," Juliana said, her voice choked with emotion, her tears falling onto the king's hand. "He saved us all." The king nodded, his gaze shifting to Aldrich, his expression hardening with resolve. "He will be rewarded," he said, his voice firm, "for his loyalty, for his courage, for his sacrifice." He then turned to the royal physician, his voice demanding, his authority unquestionable. "Save him," he ordered. "Do whatever it takes. He must live. The physician bowed, his face grim, his expression determined. I will do my best, Your Majesty, he said. But his wounds are grave. His survival is uncertain. Juliana stayed by Aldrich's side, her hand gripping his, her eyes fixed on his face, her heart filled with a desperate hope, a fervent prayer, a silent plea for his survival. She would not leave him, would not abandon him, would not give up on him. The hours passed, slow and agonizing, marked by the rhythmic rise and fall of Aldrich's chest, the faint flicker of his pulse, the whispered prayers of Juliana, the anxious pacing of the king, the silent vigil of the guards. The fate of Aldrich, the fate of Juliana, the fate of the kingdom, hung in the balance, suspended between life and death, between hope and despair, between justice and betrayal. It was a desperate plea for life, for love. Chapter 14. The Gathering Storm. The search for the queen proved fruitless. She had vanished, disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors of the castle, slipping through the secret passages, evading the guards, her escape aided by a network of loyalists who remained hidden, their allegiance to her unwavering, their motives shrouded in secrecy. The castle was in lockdown, every room searched, every servant questioned, every guard on high alert, but the queen remained elusive, a ghost in her own palace, a phantom haunting the halls of power. Juliana, torn between her vigil at Aldrich's bedside and her desperate desire to see the queen brought to justice, felt a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. She knew the queen was dangerous, that she was capable of anything, that she would stop at nothing to regain her power, to silence her enemies, to reclaim her throne. Aldrich remained unconscious, his condition precarious, his life hanging by a thread. The royal physician had done everything he could, tending to his wounds, administering herbs and potions, but his prognosis remained uncertain. Juliana never left his side, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort, sharing memories of their stolen moments, praying for his recovery, her hope flickering like a candle in the wind. The king, consumed by guilt and remorse, haunted by the specter of his own blindness, paced restlessly, his orders contradictory, his decisions erratic, his authority undermined by his own self-doubt. He had trusted the wrong people, had ignored the warnings, had allowed himself to be manipulated, and now he was paying the price. He had lost his wife, his trusted advisors were under suspicion, and the knight he had relied upon for so long lay dying. The court was in turmoil, divided by suspicion and fear, fractured by shifting loyalties, paralyzed by the uncertainty of the future. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of conspiracy, accusations of betrayal, plots and counterplots, the truth obscured by a fog of misinformation and deceit. One evening, as Juliana sat by Aldrich's bedside, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, her heart aching with grief, she heard a faint sound, a rustling of fabric, a whisper of movement. She looked up, her senses alert, her body tensing. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman dressed in the simple garb of a servant, her face hidden by a hood, her movements cautious and furtive. Juliana recognized her, with a jolt of surprise, as one of the queen's ladies-in-waiting, a woman named Alara, who had always been particularly attentive to Juliana, her smiles seemingly genuine, her concerns seemingly sincere. "Alara?" Juliana said, her voice questioning, her mind racing. What are you doing here?" Alara approached, her eyes darting nervously around the room, her hands trembling. "I need to speak to you," she whispered, her voice urgent. "It's about the queen." Juliana's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected Alara, had sensed a hidden agenda, a secret loyalty, but she had never had proof. Now, it seemed, the truth was about to be revealed. "What about her?" Juliana asked, her voice firm, despite her apprehension. She didn't act alone," Alara said, her voice barely audible. "There are others. Powerful others. They helped her. They want her back on the throne." Juliana felt a chill run down her spine. She had known the queen was not working alone, had suspected a larger conspiracy, but to hear it confirmed, to learn that there were others involved, powerful figures pulling the strings, made the situation even more dangerous, more complex, more terrifying.
Who?
Juliana demanded, her voice sharp.
Who are they?
Alara hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. I cannot say, she whispered. They would kill me. They would kill you. But you must tell me, Juliana insisted, her voice desperate. Aldrich, he's dying. The queen, she's still out there. We need to stop them. Alara looked at Aldrich, lying unconscious on the bed, his face pale, his breathing shallow. She saw the love in Juliana's eyes, the desperation in her voice, the unwavering determination in her spirit. She knew she had a choice to make, a choice between loyalty and betrayal, between fear and courage. She took a deep breath, her decision made. There is a meeting, she said, her voice low and urgent. Tonight, in the old crypt, beneath the chapel. They are planning their next move. Juliana's mind raced. The old crypt, a forgotten place, a burial ground for ancient kings and queens, a place of shadows and secrets, a perfect location for a clandestine meeting. Thank you, Juliana said, her voice filled with gratitude. You are brave. Alara shook her head. I am afraid, she whispered. But I cannot stand by and watch this happen. The queen, she is evil. She must be stopped. Alara slipped away, disappearing back into the shadows, leaving Juliana with the information, with the knowledge, with the opportunity. Juliana knew what she had to do. She had to go to the crypt, to confront the conspirators, to expose their treachery, to save Aldrich, to save the kingdom. It was a desperate gamble, a reckless act, but she had no choice. The storm was gathering, the clouds darkening, the thunder rolling. And Juliana was ready to face it. Chapter 15. Flames of Rebellion. Juliana knew she couldn't face the conspirators alone. She needed help, allies she could trust, warriors who could fight. She thought of the king, but his state of mind was too fragile, his judgment too clouded by guilt and grief. She needed someone strong, someone decisive, someone who understood the stakes. She decided to seek out Sir Gareth, Aldrich's closest friend and second in command, a knight known for his unwavering loyalty, his exceptional swordsmanship, and his quiet, steady demeanor. She found him in the training yard, overseeing the drills, his face grim, his movements precise, his energy focused on preparing his men for the uncertain future. She explained the situation, recounting Alara's revelation, describing the meeting in the crypt, outlining the danger the queen and her allies posed to the kingdom. Gareth listened intently, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening, his expression hardening with each word. We must stop them, he said, his voice low and resolute, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. We cannot allow them to succeed. We must avenge Aldrich. Gareth gathered a small group of trusted knights, men loyal to Aldrich, men who had witnessed Kester's treachery, men who suspected the queen's involvement, men who were ready to fight for justice, for honor, for the future of the kingdom. They armed themselves, donning their armor, sharpening their swords, preparing for battle. Juliana, though not a warrior, refused to be left behind. She donned a simple tunic and leggings, borrowed a sword from the armory, and strapped a dagger to her thigh. She would not be a passive observer, a helpless victim. She would fight alongside them, for Aldrich, for the kingdom, for herself. As darkness fell, they made their way to the chapel, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors, their movements silent and cautious, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The chapel was empty, save for the flickering light of the candles that illuminated the altar, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air was cool and still, scented with the faint aroma of incense and beeswax. Gareth located the entrance to the crypt, a hidden door concealed behind a large tapestry depicting the ascension of a long-dead king. He pushed aside the tapestry, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading down into the darkness. They descended, their footsteps echoing on the stone steps, their swords drawn, their senses alert, their bodies tensing with each step. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, the silence more profound, broken only by the faint sound of their breathing, the muffled thud of their hearts. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large, vaulted chamber, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The walls were lined with tombs, the resting places of ancient kings and queens, their names and deeds long forgotten, their bones turned to dust. In the center of the chamber, a group of figures were gathered around a large, stone table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single torch, their voices low and conspiratorial, their intentions deadly. Juliana recognized some of them, members of the Queen's inner circle, advisors and courtiers who had always seemed loyal to the king, but who were now revealed to be traitors, their true allegiance exposed, their treachery laid bare. And there, at the head of the table, stood the Queen, her face pale but resolute, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of anger, defiance, and desperation. She was dressed in black, a stark contrast to her usual vibrant gowns, a symbol of her mourning, a sign of her determination. The conspirators, startled by the sudden appearance of Gareth and his knights, jumped to their feet, their hands reaching for their swords, their faces a mixture of shock and alarm. "Treachery!" one of them shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "We are betrayed." "No," Gareth said, his voice cold and clear, his sword raised, his stance firm. "You are the betrayers. You have plotted against the king. You have conspired with the Queen. You have murdered." The Queen stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I am the rightful ruler of this kingdom," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "I will not be denied my throne." "Your throne?" Gareth challenged, his voice laced with contempt. "You forfeited your right to rule when you betrayed your husband, when you plotted his death, when you murdered his loyal subjects." He was weak, the Queen spat, her voice filled with venom. He was a fool. He deserved to die. Juliana, her anger overcoming her fear, stepped forward, her sword drawn, her eyes fixed on the Queen. "You are the fool," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You are the traitor. You are a murderer." The Queen's gaze shifted to Juliana, her eyes narrowing, her expression hardening with hatred. "You," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "You are the reason for all of this. You seduced him. You turned him against me." "I did nothing," Juliana said, her voice firm. "He saw you for what you are. A monster. A serpent." The Queen laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the chamber. "You are naive, child," she said. "You know nothing of power. You know nothing of love." "I know enough," Juliana said, her voice unwavering. "I know that you are evil. I know that you must be stopped." The two groups faced each other, their swords drawn, their bodies tense, their intentions clear. The flames of rebellion had been ignited, the battle lines drawn, the fate of the kingdom hanging in the balance. The crypt, a place of death, was about to become a battlefield. Chapter 16. Into the Abyss. The clash of steel echoed through the ancient crypt, a brutal symphony of violence and desperation. Gareth and his knights, outnumbered but fueled by righteous anger and unwavering loyalty, fought with a ferocity that surprised the Queen's conspirators. The confined space of the crypt, with its low ceilings and narrow passages, made for a chaotic and claustrophobic battle, where every swing of a sword, every thrust of a blade, carried the potential for deadly consequences. Juliana, though inexperienced in combat, fought with a courage born of desperation, her movements driven by a fierce determination to protect her loved ones, to avenge the wrongs that had been committed, to fight for the future of the kingdom. She parried blows, dodged attacks, and even managed to land a few strikes of her own, her sword a blur of silver in the flickering torchlight. The Queen, surprisingly, did not engage in the fighting directly. She stood at the edge of the fray, her face a mask of cold calculation, her eyes darting from one combatant to another, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of each side, searching for an opportunity, a weakness to exploit. She was a strategist, a manipulator, a puppet master, not a warrior. As the battle raged, Juliana found herself facing one of the Queen's most loyal advisors, a man named Lord Barlin, who had always treated her with a condescending politeness that masked a deep-seated contempt. He was a skilled swordsman, his movements fluid and graceful, his attacks precise and deadly. "You should have stayed out of this, girl," Barlin sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You have no place here. You are a nuisance." "I am where I belong," Juliana retorted, her voice firm, despite her fear. "Fighting for what is right. Fighting against you." They fought, their swords clashing, their bodies straining, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Barlin was clearly the superior fighter, his experience and skill far exceeding Juliana's, but she fought with a tenacity and a determination that surprised him, that pushed him, that forced him to acknowledge her as a threat. Suddenly, Barlin lunged, his sword aimed at Juliana's heart. She parried the blow, but the force of the impact sent her staggering back, her foot catching on a loose stone, causing her to lose her balance. She fell, her sword slipping from her grasp, her body hitting the cold, hard floor with a sickening thud. Barlin stood over her, his sword raised, his eyes gleaming with triumph, his expression a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. "It's over, girl," he said, his voice cold and cruel. "You were a fool to challenge us." Just as Barlin was about to deliver the final blow, a figure intervened, a blur of steel and fury. Gareth, having dispatched his own opponent, intercepted Barlin's strike, his sword deflecting the blow, saving Juliana's life. "Get away from her," Gareth roared, his voice filled with rage, his eyes blazing with fury. Gareth and Barlin fought, their swords clashing in a furious exchange, the air filled with the clang of steel, the grunts of exertion, the sharp intake of breath. Gareth, fueled by his loyalty to Aldrich, by his anger at the Queen's treachery, by his determination to protect Juliana, fought with a ferocity that overwhelmed Barlin, driving him back, forcing him to retreat. Juliana, scrambling to her feet, retrieved her sword, her body aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her determination renewed. She would not be defeated. She would not give up. She would fight on. As the battle continued, the tide began to turn. Gareth and his knights, though outnumbered, were slowly gaining the upper hand, their superior skill and their unwavering loyalty proving to be a decisive advantage. The Queen's conspirators, their initial confidence shattered, their ranks thinned by casualties, began to falter, their movements becoming hesitant, their attacks losing their force, their desperation growing. The Queen, seeing her plans unraveling, her allies falling, her power slipping away, realized that she was losing. She knew she had to escape, to regroup, to find another way to reclaim her throne, to silence her enemies, to survive. She looked around the crypt, her eyes searching for an escape route, a way out of the trap she had created for herself. She spotted a narrow passage, hidden behind a crumbling tomb, a passage that led to the catacombs beneath the castle, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, a place where she could disappear, where she could hide. She made her move, slipping away from the fray, her movements silent and cautious, her escape unnoticed by most of the combatants, their attention focused on the immediate threat, on the clash of steel, on the struggle for survival. But Juliana saw her. She saw the Queen slipping away, her face a mask of cold determination, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. Juliana knew she had to stop her. She couldn't let her escape, couldn't let her continue her reign of terror, couldn't let her win. She broke away from her own fight. This chase was a descent into the abyss of the castle, of herself. Chapter 17. Scars of the Heart. Juliana pursued the Queen into the darkness of the catacombs, leaving the sounds of battle behind, entering a realm of silence and shadows, a labyrinth of twisting passages and hidden chambers, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. She moved cautiously, her sword drawn, her senses alert, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and determination. The catacombs were a disorienting maze, a network of tunnels that stretched beneath the castle, a place where the dead were buried, where secrets were hidden, where the past lingered like a ghostly presence. The walls were lined with tombs, the bones of ancient kings and queens, forgotten nobles and loyal servants, their lives reduced to dust and whispers. Juliana knew the queen had an advantage, that she knew the layout of the catacombs, that she had likely used these tunnels before, that she was familiar with their twists and turns, their hidden entrances and secret exits. But Juliana was driven by a fierce determination, fueled by her love for Aldrich, by her desire for justice, by her need to end the queen's reign of terror, once and for all. She followed the faint sound of the queen's footsteps, the rustle of her gown, the whisper of her breath, her own movements silent and cautious, her senses straining to detect any sign of her presence, any hint of her direction. As she moved deeper into the catacombs, she found herself in a large, vaulted chamber, the air colder, the silence more profound, the darkness more complete. In the center of the chamber, she saw a faint light, a flickering glow that emanated from a single torch, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She approached cautiously, her sword raised, her body tense, her senses alert. She saw the queen standing before a large, stone sarcophagus, her back to Juliana, her hands resting on the lid, her body trembling, her voice muttering words that Juliana couldn't understand. It was a ritual, Juliana realized, a dark magic, a desperate attempt to summon power, to gain strength, to survive. The queen was not just a political manipulator, a schemer, a traitor. She was something more, something darker, something evil. Juliana stepped forward, her sword raised, her voice firm, despite her fear.
"It's over, Your Majesty," she said.
"You are finished." The queen turned, her face contorted with rage, her eyes blazing with a supernatural light, her expression a mixture of defiance and despair. "You cannot stop me," she hissed, her voice distorted, her words laced with a venomous power. "I am invincible." She raised her hands, her fingers glowing with an unnatural energy, her body surrounded by a swirling vortex of darkness. She unleashed a blast of power, a force that slammed into Juliana, throwing her back against the wall, her body hitting the stone with a sickening thud, her sword slipping from her grasp, her breath knocked from her lungs. Juliana struggled to her feet, her body aching, her head spinning, her vision blurred. She saw the queen advancing towards her, her hands raised, her eyes filled with a murderous intent, her expression a mask of pure evil. "You are nothing," the queen spat, her voice dripping with contempt.
"A pawn.
"A fool.
You will die."
Juliana knew she was outmatched, that she couldn't defeat the queen in a direct confrontation, that her magic was too powerful, her darkness too strong. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She would fight. She dodged the queen's next attack, her movements agile and desperate, her body fueled by adrenaline, her mind focused on survival. She scrambled for her sword, her fingers closing around the hilt, her grip tightening, her determination renewed. She saw an opening, a flicker of vulnerability in the queen's defenses, a moment of hesitation, a hint of doubt. She lunged, her sword thrusting forward, her aim true, her strike unexpected. Her blade pierced the queen's shoulder, drawing a cry of pain, a scream of rage, a gasp of surprise. The queen staggered back, her hands clutching her wounded shoulder, her eyes widening in disbelief, her expression shifting from confident power to startled fear. The dark magic that had surrounded her dissipated, the swirling vortex of darkness fading, the unnatural light in her eyes extinguished, her power weakened. Juliana stood over her, her sword raised, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. She could have killed her. She had every right, every justification. The queen had tried to murder her, had murdered Aldrich's wife, her own mother, and caused so much pain. But she hesitated. She looked at the queen, her face pale and contorted with pain, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. She saw not a monster, not a demon, but a broken woman, a woman consumed by her own ambition, by her own darkness, by her own despair. Juliana lowered her sword. "It's over," she said, her voice soft, yet firm. "It's finished." The queen collapsed to the ground, her body trembling, her strength gone, her power broken. She looked up at Juliana, her eyes filled with tears, her voice a whisper.
"Why?" she asked.
"Why spare me?" "Because I am not like you," Juliana said, her voice filled with a quiet strength, a newfound wisdom, a profound understanding. "I will not become you." The scars of the heart were deep, but they were starting to heal, finally. Chapter 18. The Unveiling. The Queen's capture brought a semblance of order back to the fractured court of Hymir. With the conspirators either dead or imprisoned, and the king slowly regaining his composure, the immediate threat had subsided. However, the scars of the rebellion ran deep, leaving behind a residue of suspicion, mistrust, and uncertainty. Aldrich, though still weak and recovering from his wounds, had regained consciousness. The first thing he asked for was Juliana. Their reunion was a quiet, poignant moment, filled with unspoken emotions, shared relief, and a deepening of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of danger and betrayal. He held her hand, his gaze searching her face, his touch conveying a gratitude that words could not express. Juliana, in turn, stayed by his side, tending to his needs, offering comfort and reassurance, her presence a constant source of strength and hope. She recounted the events of the crypt, her confrontation with the queen, her decision to spare her life, her unwavering belief in the power of mercy and redemption. Aldrich listened, his eyes filled with admiration, his heart swelling with love, his respect for her deepening with each word. He understood her choice, he approved of her compassion, he recognized the strength of her character, the purity of her soul. The king, humbled by his own failings and deeply grateful for Juliana's courage and Aldrich's loyalty, summoned them both to his private chambers. He had made a decision that would affect the future of the kingdom, a decision that would honor the sacrifices that had been made, a decision that would atone for his past mistakes. He sat on his throne, his posture still regal, but his demeanor softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. He looked at Aldrich, his most trusted knight, his friend, his savior, lying on a makeshift bed, his body weakened, but his spirit unbroken. "Aldrich," the king said, his voice hoarse, but firm, "you have served me faithfully, loyally, courageously. You have risked your life to protect me, to protect the kingdom, to expose the treachery that had taken root within my own court." Aldrich nodded, his gaze unwavering, his expression respectful, his loyalty unquestionable. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," the king continued, his voice filled with emotion. "But I will do everything in my power to honor your sacrifice, to reward your loyalty, to ensure your future." He then turned to Juliana, his gaze softening, his expression filled with gratitude and admiration. "Juliana," he said, his voice gentle, yet firm, "you have shown remarkable courage, extraordinary resilience, and a profound understanding of justice and mercy. You have saved Aldrich's life. You have exposed the queen's treachery. You have saved the kingdom." Juliana bowed her head, her heart filled with a mixture of humility and pride. She had done what she believed was right, had followed her conscience, had fought for what she believed in, had risked everything. "I hereby declare," the king announced, his voice resonating through the chamber, his authority restored, his judgment clear, his purpose defined, "that Aldrich Montrose, upon his full recovery, shall be named my heir, the future king of Hymir." A gasp of surprise rippled through the room, followed by a murmur of approval, a sense of relief, a recognition of the justice, the rightness, of the king's decision. Aldrich, stunned by the announcement, his eyes widening in disbelief, his body tensing with a mixture of shock and humility, struggled to speak. "Your Majesty," he stammered, his voice weak, but filled with emotion. I am not worthy, you are worthy," the king interrupted, his voice firm. "You are the most worthy man I know. You have proven your loyalty, your courage, your wisdom. You will be a great king." He then turned back to Juliana, his gaze softening further, his expression filled with a fatherly affection, a silent blessing, a profound respect. "And Juliana," he said, his voice gentle, yet firm, "you shall be his queen." Juliana's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Aldrich, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze filled with love, with gratitude, with hope. She saw a future filled with challenges, with responsibilities, with uncertainty. But she also saw a future filled with love, with companionship, with purpose. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, her voice choked with emotion. I accept," she whispered. The king smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that conveyed a sense of peace, of resolution, of hope. The unveiling was complete, and a future, uncertain, but filled with the promise of love. Chapter 19. A Choice Made. The news of Aldrich's elevation to heir and his betrothal to Juliana spread through the castle and the kingdom like wildfire, igniting a mixture of celebration, relief, and renewed hope. The dark cloud of the queen's treachery began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of optimism, a belief in a brighter future, a trust in the leadership of the man who had risked everything to save them all. Preparations for the wedding were underway, but they were markedly different from the lavish, politically driven spectacle that had been planned before. This wedding would be a celebration of love, of loyalty, of courage, a symbol of the new era that was dawning, an affirmation of the values that had triumphed over darkness and deceit. Juliana, though still adjusting to the enormity of her new role, embraced her responsibilities with a quiet determination, a newfound confidence, a profound sense of purpose. She was no longer a pawn, a ward of the crown, a passive observer. She was an active participant, a leader, a future queen, a woman who had found her voice, her strength, her destiny. She spent hours with Aldrich, discussing their plans for the future, sharing their hopes and dreams, making decisions together, their partnership solidifying with each passing day, their love deepening with each shared conversation, each stolen moment, each lingering glance. Aldrich, though still recovering from his wounds, was gradually regaining his strength, his spirit buoyed by Juliana's love, by the king's trust, by the prospect of a future he had never dared to imagine. He was determined to be a good king, a just ruler, a leader who would serve his people, protect his kingdom, and honor the sacrifices that had been made. One evening, as they sat together in the gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Aldrich took Juliana's hand, his touch gentle, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Juliana," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I know this is not the life you envision for yourself. You were raised to be a pawn, a piece in a game you didn't understand. You deserve a choice." Juliana looked at him, her eyes meeting his, her heart filled with a profound understanding, a deep appreciation for his sensitivity, his respect, his love. "I have made my choice, Aldrich," she said, her voice firm, yet gentle. "I choose you. I choose this life. I choose us." Aldrich smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that conveyed a sense of relief, of gratitude, of unconditional love. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their bond, that affirmed their commitment, that promised a future together. But there was one loose end that remained, one unresolved issue that cast a shadow over their happiness, one decision that needed to be made. The queen. She remained imprisoned in the castle dungeons, awaiting trial, her fate uncertain, her power broken, her spirit diminished. The king had initially ordered her execution, his anger and betrayal demanding swift and brutal justice. But Juliana had pleaded for mercy, arguing that death would not solve anything, that it would only perpetuate the cycle of violence and hatred, that it would dishonor Aldrich's sacrifice. She had visited the queen in her cell, a cold, damp, and desolate place, a stark contrast to the opulent chambers she had once occupied. She had found her a broken woman, her arrogance gone, her defiance shattered, her spirit crushed. The queen had looked at Juliana, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and regret. "You defeated me," she had whispered, her voice hoarse, her body trembling. "No," Juliana had replied, her voice soft yet firm. "You defeated yourself. You chose darkness. You chose evil." "I did what I had to do," the queen had insisted, her voice laced with a desperate plea for understanding. "To survive. To protect my power." "Power is not worth the price you paid," Juliana had said. "Love, loyalty, compassion, those are the things that matter. Those are the things that endure." The queen had looked away, her eyes filling with tears, her silence a confession, her defeat complete. Juliana and Aldrich visited the king and told of this encounter. "She is no threat now," Aldrich declared. Juliana added, "Her spirit is gone. Let her live out her days repenting, not empowered by martyrdom." The king, moved by Juliana's compassion, by Aldrich's wisdom, and, at that time, rescinded his order. He decreed that the queen would be banished, stripped of her title, her wealth, her power, and sent to a remote convent, where she would live out her days in quiet contemplation, in prayer and repentance, her punishment a life of solitude, a life of reflection. It was a choice made, a choice for mercy. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The wedding of Juliana and Aldrich was a simple, yet profoundly moving ceremony, held not in the grandeur of the great hall, but in the intimate setting of the castle chapel, the same chapel where their journey had begun, the same chapel where they had shared stolen moments, whispered secrets, and a growing, undeniable love. The guests were not the assembled nobility of the kingdom, but a select group of close friends, loyal knights, and trusted servants, those who had stood by them through the trials and tribulations, those who had witnessed their courage, their loyalty, their love. Juliana wore a gown of simple white silk, embroidered with silver thread, her hair adorned with wildflowers, her beauty radiant, her spirit shining, her heart filled with a joy she had never thought possible. She was no longer a pawn, a ward of the crown, a reluctant bride. She was a woman in love, a future queen, a woman who had found her voice, her strength, her destiny. Aldrich, standing tall and proud, his wounds healed, his spirit renewed, his eyes filled with a love that transcended words, waited for her at the altar. He wore a simple tunic of blue, the color of his family crest, a symbol of his heritage, a reminder of his duty, a testament to his honor. The king, his face etched with a mixture of pride, relief, and a lingering sadness, gave Juliana away, his hand trembling slightly as he placed hers in Aldrich's, his blessing a silent acknowledgement of their love, a quiet acceptance of their future, a profound gratitude for their sacrifice. The vows they exchanged were not the traditional, formalized pronouncements of duty and obedience, but heartfelt declarations of love, of loyalty, of partnership, of a shared commitment to a future filled with hope, with challenges, with purpose. Juliana, she said, her voice clear and strong, her eyes locked on Aldrich's, her heart overflowing with love. Take you, Aldrich, to be my husband, my partner, my friend, my love. I promise to stand by your side, through good times and bad, through sickness and health, through peace and war. I promise to be true to you, to honor you, to love you, always. Aldrich, he said, his voice deep and resonant, his gaze unwavering, his heart filled with a love that knew no bounds. Take you, Juliana, to be my wife, my partner, my queen, my love. I promise to protect you, to cherish you, to support you, to love you, always. They exchanged rings, simple bands of silver, symbols of their eternal bond, their unbreakable connection, their unconditional love. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, their union blessed, their future sealed, their love triumphant. The celebration that followed was not a lavish feast, but a simple gathering, a shared meal, a heartfelt expression of joy and gratitude, a celebration of love, of loyalty, of hope. There was music, laughter, and dancing, but the focus remained on the newly married couple, on their radiant happiness, on their palpable connection, on their undeniable love. As the evening drew to a close, Juliana and Aldrich stood together on the castle battlements, watching the moon rise over the kingdom, their hands clasped, their hearts intertwined, their future stretching before them, a tapestry woven with threads of love, of duty, of hope. "We did it," Juliana said, her voice soft, her eyes shining with tears of joy.
"We survived."
"We did," Aldrich agreed, his voice filled with emotion, his arm wrapping around her waist, drawing her close.
"And we will thrive."
They looked out over the kingdom, their responsibility, their future. They knew there would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, battles to fight. But they also knew that they would face them together, united by their love, strengthened by their bond, guided by their purpose. The final reckoning was this, that love and duty, when intertwined, could create the strongest bonds, the greatest victories. The pawn had become a queen. The knight had become an heir. And their future unwritten began. Epilogue. Years passed, marked by the steady rhythm of seasons, the ebb and flow of courtly life, the growth and prosperity of the kingdom. Juliana and Aldrich ruled Hymir with wisdom, compassion, and a deep commitment to justice, their reign a golden age of peace and prosperity, their love a beacon of hope and inspiration to all who knew them. They had children, strong sons and graceful daughters, who inherited their parents' courage, their loyalty, and their unwavering sense of duty. The line of succession was secure, the future of the kingdom assured, the legacy of their love enduring. The memory of the queen's treachery faded, becoming a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of ambition, the corrupting influence of power, the importance of vigilance. The old crypt remained sealed, a silent testament to the darkness that had once threatened to consume the kingdom, a reminder of the courage that had saved it. Juliana never forgot her promise to the queen, her commitment to mercy, her belief in redemption. She visited the convent regularly, bringing gifts and news of the kingdom, offering comfort and companionship to the woman who had once been her enemy, the woman who had tried to destroy her. The queen, her spirit humbled, her heart softened by Juliana's kindness, had found a measure of peace in her solitude, her days spent in prayer and contemplation, her past a constant reminder of her failings, her future a blank slate. She had learned, in her isolation, the true meaning of love, the true value of loyalty, the true importance of compassion. She had come to understand that power without love is empty, that ambition without purpose is destructive, that mercy is the greatest strength. One day, as Juliana was leaving the convent, the queen stopped her, her voice frail, but filled with a sincerity that Juliana had never heard before. "Thank you," she said, her eyes filled with tears, "for sparing my life, for showing me a better way." Juliana smiled, a gentle, compassionate smile, a smile that conveyed forgiveness, understanding, and hope. "You're welcome," she said. "We all make mistakes. It is what we do afterward that matters." Aldrich, throughout his reign, remained true to his oath, his commitment to justice, his unwavering loyalty to his people. He ruled with wisdom and compassion, his decisions guided by a deep sense of responsibility, his actions inspired by a profound love for his kingdom. He never forgot the sacrifices that had been made, the lives that had been lost, the darkness that had threatened to engulf them all. He honored the memory of those who had fallen. He rewarded the loyalty of those who had stood by him. He never took his power for granted. Years later, Juliana and Aldrich, their hair silvered by time, stood where it all began. Juliana traced patterns on Aldrich's palm. "Do you regret it? Any of this?" Aldrich captured her hand and pressed a kiss to each finger. "Never. Not one moment. Even the shadows held you." And he her. As they walked hand in hand through the castle gardens, the scent of roses filling the air, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn, they knew that their love story, a story born of danger and betrayal, of courage and sacrifice, of love and duty, would be told for generations to come, a legend whispered in the halls of Hymir, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. a celebration of a love that had conquered all.